With Mission Impossible Rogue Nation just around the corner, it's an appropriate time to look back at where this franchise began. Every journey demands a first step, and just as important as that first step is what led to that first step. In this case, a TV show. The TV show was created by Bruce Geller and ran from 1966 to 1973. My dad bought the first 2 seasons on DVD years ago, and to this day, we still have only watched season 1 all the way through. One day, I promise. As for the movies, I have seen all of them, and I believe the first one I ever saw was the second one. And since then, I have been a loyal fan of this series. I love watching these films, and I'm always thrilled when a new one comes out because that means a new team, bigger stunts, and an opportunity to hear the iconic theme song which never gets old, and I get to hear it in a proper setting, a movie theater. Now, without further ado, the Mission Impossible series, 1 through 4. And yes, there will be spoilers. We begin with Mission Impossible. In my opinion, it's a really good movie. The story follows IMF agent Ethan Hunt as he works to uncover the truth behind a failed mission in Prague involving the knock list. After he learns from his boss that the mission was a setup to uncover a mole in the IMF and that he is now suspected of being it, Ethan makes a run for it and develops a plan to prove his innocence. This film had the honor of being the first project taken on by Tom Cruise and Paula Wagner under their production company, Cruise Wagner Productions. They worked early on with Sidney Pollack to develop the script, but things changed, and Brian De Palma was brought on, along with 3 screenwriters. In collaboration, they made a movie that was meant to introduce a new generation to Mission Impossible and make them want more. As time and ticket sales have shown, they succeeded. What I love about this movie is how it relies on suspense, then explosions to engage us and tell the story. Nowadays we get one loud action scene after another. This movie relies on genuine old-school suspense. I also love Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt. He is one of the most devoted actors working today and delivers a passionate performance. And speaking of passion, the filmmakers pulled off some pretty incredible action scenes. My favorite one takes place inside the CIA's headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And thanks to Paul Hirsch's editing and the sound mix, it remains one of the best suspense scenes I have ever seen. From a directorial standpoint, De Palma infused the film with his trademark Dutch angle and the split diopter camera effect. If you have been watching me for a while, then you know that I am not a fan of the Dutch angle. I am fully aware of the intentions behind it and know that it's not always a terrible thing. I just have never taken a personal liking to it. With that said, this film is one of the few exceptions where the angle actually didn't bother me. I think it has to do with the fact that De Palma only uses them during very intense moments when a dramatic change is unwinding, and during those moments, they work just fine. Where I think the film could have improved is story choices, story clarity, the number of twists, and the characters. Save for Ethan Hunt, very few if any characters have a unique voice and are interesting, and in a film like this, that's critical. Regarding story choices, having the first film deal with a mole inside the IMF is fine, but I don't like that Phelps ends up being the mole, because it makes no sense to make us dislike a character who was a good guy in the TV show. A second story choice I did not like is Claire being Jim's wife. If it were not for the dialogue that states this fact, we would never know they were a couple in the movie. And on top of that, them being a couple never ever benefits the story. So why bother? Concerning story clarity, there's a big reliance on dialogue to clarify and reveal certain story elements, like Claire knowing Jim isn't dead. I wish a less boring and obvious method had been used to make those moments less of a chore to get through. Last but not least, there are the number of twists in this movie. Given how this is the spy genre, filmmakers can have a lot of fun building up to a really great twist, and there are some good twists in this film, but I think this film relies too heavily on that device because the more twists we get, the less effective they become. They fall flat. But overall, for the first movie in this franchise, it pulled off the impossible. Pun definitely intended. I give Mission Impossible 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next we have Mission Impossible 2, directed by John Woo. In my opinion, it's a fun movie. The story follows Ethan Hunt and a new crew as they go head-to-head with Sean Ambrose, a former IMF agent turned bad. He's after a virus called Chimera, which he plans to sell to the highest bidder. To get close to Sean, Ethan puts his ex-girlfriend, Naya, undercover, back in Sean's hands. But as soon as he does, things go downhill. Fast. After Brian De Palma passed on directing this, the job went to John Woo, and with him on board, the film got a dose of raw energy and romance. As a filmmaker, John Woo is heavily influenced by Martin Scorsese, and cites Mean Streets as one of the 2 films that changed his life. It's worth noting that in Mean Streets, Martin Scorsese strategically implemented music and slow motion, a style that Woo puts to use in this movie. What I like about this movie is the story. It deals with a concept I love, loyalty. The first film deals with it also, but in this film I think it's more interesting. There's this love triangle between Ethan, Naya, and Sean. Naya's loyalty to Ethan sees her testing her loyalty with Sean. Both men ache for her, but only Ethan and Naya share a mutual physical and emotional chemistry. There's also the loyalty between Sean and Hugh. Very few action films feature that kind of rapport, but it works well, it adds tension, and it has to. Otherwise, their final scene would hold no weight. But thankfully there is weight, both in the drama and action, which includes a very cool reimagination of the cable suspension scene. It's taken to new heights and involves an even bigger ventilation shaft. My favorite scene is when Sean pretends to be Ethan and instructs Naya to stay with him. I love this scene because Sean is able to see how Naya feels about Ethan, and the mask hides his emotions. Despite him being the villain, it's a heartbreaking scene, and I sympathize with Sean. Where I think the film could have improved is the characters, the editing, the plausibility, the story continuity, and the dialogue. In action films, it is typical to have cheesy dialogue, and thanks to Robert Towne, we get grade A cheese, resulting in cheesy acting. Concerning story continuity, the first cut of this film was 3.5 hours. The studio forced John Woo to cut it down below 2 hours. The final film runs 2 hours and 3 minutes, just above that 2 hours. Can you imagine that? As a result, there is a physical disconnection in the overall plot of this film, unfortunately. Regarding plausibility, when it comes to a film like this, I can suspend disbelief about quite a few things. But one thing I had a hard time with were the masks. The masks are a trademark of this franchise, and they're a fun tool that when used right can make for a really great reveal. But I find it hard to believe not only that Sean has one for Ethan, but that Ethan has one for Hugh for the finale. Okay, first of all, how does Ambrose have the means to make a mask? And second of all, how does Ethan know which henchman he's going to encounter before coming face to face with Ambrose? The funny thing is, I recall like it was yesterday when I watched this years ago with my mom, and when this part came on, when Ethan ran out the room like a badass with the 2 vials and ripped his Hugh mask off in slow motion and revealed himself, my mom and I were so excited. It was such a badass moment. And now, looking at it now, I'm just like, BS meters going off. When it comes to the editing, John Woo packed this film with a style that called for slow motion and quick cuts. Given how this movie is meant to be very fast and exciting, I can understand this choice. But the slow motion is rarely story motivated, and the cuts can make for a disorienting experience, and the geography of the characters can get confusing. Last but not least, there are the characters. Very few of them are fleshed out beyond their role in the mission. Billy Barrett, for example, is established as the pilot and has dialogue that tells Ethan what he can provide skills-wise. But after that, we learn nothing about him. I wish the characters were actual people and not just tools. Rest assured though, I still enjoyed this film. The best part is, this franchise only gets better. I give Mission Impossible 2 3 out of 5 stars. Next we have Mission Impossible 3, directed by J.J. Abrams. In my opinion, it's a great movie. The story follows Ethan Hunt as he chases down an arms dealer named Owen Davian, following a failed mission to save a former student of his. After capturing and then losing Davian, he gets told to obtain and deliver an item known as the Rabbit's Foot. He has 48 hours to do so, or his wife will die. Mission Impossible 3 is a special sequel. Reason being is, it not only marks one of the few times when the third movie in a franchise is actually better than the first two, it also marks the feature film debut of TV director J.J. Abrams. And as we all know, regardless of whether it's on ABC or Netflix, TV employs a strict structure that allows less time to tell a story. But given the desired pacing for this film, Abrams' background helped make this installment tighter and much more focused. From an action standpoint, Cruise & Company pulled off a number of very fast, very intense, and exciting action scenes. They all display impressive stunt work, and thankfully, don't drag on for too long. My favorite scene is the first scene, a countdown scene with no score. It's my favorite opening in all the Mission films. It's full of tension and remains one of the most effective opening scenes I have ever seen. It also offers a taste of the film's best performance, Philip Seymour Hoffman. Sadly, we lost him a year ago, but this film is a reminder that no matter what the role, he always put his all into it. He is to this day my favorite Mission Impossible villain. On a more positive note, one of my favorite actors ever is in this movie, Simon Pegg. He's really not given that much to do, but he is still a joy to watch. I mean, it's Simon Pegg. And thankfully, we'll see more of him in the next mission. But hey, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Where I think the film could have improved is the MacGuffin, the plausibility, and the story. During a scene later in the film between Hunt and Musgrave, a lot of info is verbally dispensed to bring clarity to motivations and events. Funny enough, that scene was rewritten on the day, and as a result, Billy Crudup required cue cards to read off of. It really just adds insult to injury because if the story had been worked differently, that mind-numbing speech could have been avoided. Concerning the plausibility, there's a part where Ethan gives his wife a very quick demo on how to use a gun. She then goes about using it without a hitch, while Ethan is temporarily dead. I guess you could argue it's the adrenaline, but I don't know, I just personally find it hard to believe she could learn how to use a gun that fast. Another item within that scene, which is actually before the gun bit, is how long Ethan has to live versus how long he actually remains alive due to the charge in his head. In the movie, he remains alive longer than the maybe 4 minutes that Davian states, and films always do these kinds of things where they say a time and it takes longer than actually that amount of time. Now, I'm thinking, just change the line, easy. Now, maybe psychologically it wouldn't have been as tension-filled, but maybe just 5 minutes, that would have been perfect. 5 minutes, easy fix, then more plausible. With all that said, this film is a major upgrade from number 2. It's more emotional and is consistently engaging. I give Mission Impossible 3 4 out of 5 stars. Finally, we have Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, directed by Brad Bird. In my opinion, it's really good. The story follows Ethan Hunt and a brand new team as they work to track down a terrorist called Hendrix. He has access to Russian nuclear launch codes and plans to strike on the US. After he frames the IMF for bombing the Kremlin, the team goes rogue on a high-stakes journey to defeat Hendrix and stop the attack. This film marks the live-action directorial debut of Brad Bird. He picked a very ambitious and expensive project, but thankfully, he was able to prove his chops don't lie solely in animation. This came out in theaters back in 2011, and I have a very positive memory of seeing this in IMAX. I recall not being able to sleep very well the night before because I knew I was going to see The Dark Knight Rises prologue in front of the movie. Long story short, that day was definitely a win-win. Looking back, what I admire about this franchise, which actually may annoy others, is how every film is diverse in style. Every film has its own director. It keeps things fresh and interesting. It's not like going to Transformers 4 and knowing how things will play out. Brian De Palma is not John Woo, is not J.J. Abrams, is not Brad Bird, and that's a good thing. But even with these diverse filmmakers, one element that has remained consistent and is crucially important, it remains consistent, is the passion Tom Cruise has for his role and this franchise. It would have been easy to make this film just for the money, but 4 films in this franchise still makes positive headlines, and that's a reflection on the attitude the filmmakers bring to the table. It's devotion to craft and quality that brings fans back. One of the elements that makes this mission distinguishable is how it uses the locations not just as a pretty backdrop, but as a way to test the characters. When Ethan is scaling Burj Khalifa, for example, it's not only visually interesting, it also creates a legit physical challenge for Ethan. And then there's the sandstorm, which complicates things even more, but doesn't feel out of place given the location. I also like how the story doesn't go down that path that sequels sometimes go down by this point in the franchise, where you have that revenge-thirsty sibling of someone who got killed earlier and then they just pop up like, "You killed my brother or sister, now you're gonna die." Granted, the threat of nuclear war isn't exactly a fresh idea, but in my opinion, it's more plausible, and plus it cuts right to the chase. It makes for a more straightforward mission. In terms of a favorite scene, I don't really have one actually, but I do have a favorite shot. Yes, a favorite shot. It's when Ethan and Benji are making their way down a corridor in the Kremlin, and Benji almost gives them away by placing his face in front of the camera. It's a great moment because it adds tension whilst simultaneously being hilarious. It also just makes complete sense that Benji would do that, because he totally would. Where I think the film could have improved is the pacing, the dialogue, and Paula Patton's character. Given how this is a movie star movie, it's no surprise she's presented as glamorous eye candy. But a backstory that gives her a credible reason to be on the mission would have made her look even better. Regarding the pacing, this film comes in at 133 minutes, and with that time, certain story beats are delayed, and a few dialogue scenes aren't as concise as they could be. The result is an uneven journey that gets you going, then slows down. Thankfully though, as a result of Brad Bird's direction and Tom Cruise's devotion to quality action film storytelling, this franchise remains on the right track. I give Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol 3.5 out of 5 stars. And now, with the hard part out of the way, let's rank. From favorite to least favorite Mission Impossible film, 3, 4, 1, 2. Out of the 4 directors, my favorite is J.J. Abrams. My least favorite is John Woo. Out of all the villains, my favorite is Owen Davian. My least favorite is John Voight. And there you have it, the Mission Impossible series up to now. Thank you very much for your time and support. I really appreciate it. My Rogue Nation review will be up soon. Don't know when exactly, but soon.